Been playing around with this Hemi head for a while now, and I've got it ported out on the intake and the exhaust. Now earlier you guys saw that I couldn't get my finger through there, and now if my finger was longer I could touch clean to the other side on the intake, and we roll around to the exhaust, which is a lot more restrictive. I still need to polish that, by the way, but I can run through and touch the other side on the exhaust as well. So I've really open these chambers up, and if you look on the intake you can see where I've left ridges. Well, those are actually slightly spiraled ridges that go down into the intake side, and you see the little rubber seal there on the intake where the valve goes through the guide, but I've left ridges that are slightly spiraled in there so that whenever I'm sucking fuel and air into the intake, I'm actually going to get a little bit of a spiral spin to that air. You know, it's going to be ever slight, but it's going to help mix the air and fuel going into there for more performance. Now I need to, like I said, polish that exhaust side over there. It looks really scratched up, but it's really not. But I'm going to polish that out some more. And after I get all this polished, then I'm going to put the valves and the springs and everything back in the head, and throw a couple bolts in, put the rods and everything in it, and then I can check to see how much more I could take off of this head. But the way I've got this head milled down already, this lip is actually smaller than the piston, so it's really dropped down the combustion chamber. And I've checked, I put the piston on top dead center, and if I've got the clearance, instead of taking more off this head, which I am going to lightly polish it, but instead of taking more off the head, I'm probably going to mill down the deck height on the engine that the head mounts to. And if I could take a 1/16 of an inch off of the deck height, that's really going to take a lot of area out of my combustion chamber. It'll take more out than it would if I mill the head down more. So it's going to really increase my combustion on this engine by removing that down, because it's going to take more space out of the combustion chamber by removing some of the deck than it will on this head. Because if I mill it down more, I'm not going to gain a whole lot here, you know, as far as like bringing this up. But if I mill down that deck, it's going to take a lot more out, and it'll really increase my combustion ratio. And once we get this all done, I've got a compression tester, and we can check the compression on this engine and see how many psi of compression I've got, as opposed to you know, a stock engine, which I don't have a stock engine to test, but I can look up and see what the compression on a stock Hemi Predator is, and see how much we've increased our compression by doing this and lapping the valves. And then I've got a 25 millimeter exhaust valve and a 27 mil intake valve off of another engine that I'm going to throw on here. They're a stock valve, but they're coming off of a 250cc head that I've got sitting here, and the shafts on the valves are the same. So in actuality, by shaving some of the head off and shaving some of the deck, I'm actually going to get a little bit more lift out of my valves. Even if I'm using you know, a stock style valves, I'm still going to get just a little bit more lift whenever I take this off, because it's going to give me a taller stroke on that cam. Even though it's still a stock cam, I'm going to have a little bit longer duration and a little bit more lift on my valves by shortening this head or shortening the deck, whichever I find out I can do. So anyway, I'm going to get me some 900 grit sandpaper and wrap it around my finger and polish this exhaust. And then we'll move on to the next step that I'm doing on this. See what I mean about the piston not going all the way up flush? Run this engine around, and we'll go back up. And you see that it doesn't, there you go, it doesn't go all the way up. So if I can mill a little bit off of the deck here, it's gonna reduce my combustion chamber by quite a bit and increase my compression by doing that. And it's also going to smooth out this gasket surface for a new gasket. There you go. That's as high as it goes, and I could take a couple thousandths off of it. Let's grab a feeler gauge over here and see how many thousandths I should be able to take off of that as long as I don't have a hit. Yeah, there you go. There's an engine pouring right there. That's another one. I'm trying to find a carburetor for that engine, but that one's been bored, head shaved, and everything else. But the carburetor is just garbage. And I've been trying to locate another carburetor for that engine. But that one started out as a 12.5 horse. It's been bored and shaved and ported and everything else, and it's got a fuel pump for it. So that one's going to be a monster if I could find the right parts. All right, let's see. That's yeah, overspray from painting the paint cart. There we go. So I could actually take 0.6 millimeters off of the deck, almost a millimeter off of that deck, but that'll make a huge difference on compression. I'm telling you, when I paint, I need to set me up a paint booth and stuff and move things out of the way, because I've got a lot of pink on this that I got to polish off now. But because you don't want to paint your vented areas on your engine, especially on these small ones. They've got to breathe, and if they don't breathe, it'll overheat. But yeah, I think we're gonna be able to mill that down, but we got to find out for sure if we got room. Here is some 320 grit sandpaper, and I just cut a strip off of it and put it on the end of this dowel rod at an angle, zip tied it real tight, and then I'm just going to wrap the sandpaper around the dowel rod tight, and that'll get me in the exhaust side so that I can polish it out. But yeah, that's a little hillbilly tool that I learned how to make years ago to get down in tight places to sand out and smooth and polish. Hillbilly valve lapping. I was looking in the shop and I couldn't find my valve lapping compound. So what I did was I took some 900 grit sandpaper. I just took a sheet of it, and I folded it over, and I put the grit to grit, and I rubbed it on itself like that, one-handed, but I rubbed it grit to grit, and I got me a pile of grit from the sandpaper down in that fold. And I took some assembly lube, engine assembly lube, and I mixed it with that grit, and then I put it on the valve. And I used two hands, which I can't do that right now because I'm recording with one hand, but I held the head kind of like this, and I took my middle finger and I pushed up on the valve stem, and then I took my thumb on my other hand after I put the grit on the valve and push it down in there. And let me switch hands here. Shoot, sorry guys. Anyway, with the upward pressure on the valve and holding the head with the left hand, I took my right hand and I put my thumb on the valve and I rotated the valve with the engine assembly lube and sandpaper grit, 900 grit sandpaper grit mix. And I used my thumb to rotate the valve in there while I used my left hand to hold the head and push up on the valve from the stem here so that I can control the pressure on the valve. And without any tools, I used some engine assembly lube and some sandpaper grit to lap my valves. And as you can see, I got about 2 mil of valve seat that I milled out by hand on the exhaust and the intake there. And you see how thin the intake edge is. I spent about 30 minutes milling the valves with homemade stuff. Anyway, Brad used Fast Orange hand cleaner as a valve lapping compound, and he lapped his valves like I did with my sandpaper and assembly lube. And Brad got just as good a job, if not better of a job, with the Fast Orange hand cleaner, lapping his valves by hand just like I did, with pushing up on the valve stem and holding the head, and then using the other hand to put downward pressure and rotate the valve. So yeah, he did a really good job on his valves. He sent me pictures and they are absolutely beautiful. They turned out just as good as my valves, if not better, whenever he lapped them. And then we used the same solution to polish the stems on our valves so they'll slide in the valve guide real easy. Now, I did my intake with sandpaper and oil assembly lube, and that worked really good. And my exhaust valve that I polished and ported, you see my valve angle right there, it's absolutely beautiful. It's polished really good. It's, you know, about a fingernail's thickness. And you see my valve seat. What I used on the exhaust is toothpaste. Baking soda and peroxide Colgate toothpaste with no valve grinding tool whatsoever. It's all done by hand. And I hold the head here, push up on the valve, and then take my other hand and use it to add down a slight downward pressure. And I rotated half turn on that valve with Colgate toothpaste to rotate that valve and polish that valve, and to set a wider valve seat on the intake. And you can see my polished intake that I did with the grooved runners, but I still left a lot of material out here for gasket face because I don't want to blow an intake gasket. And I did the same thing on the exhaust. I used the file. It's a milling file, round milling file that I used in there to run down through and open my exhaust. And you can see how open the exhaust is. Let's push the intake valve out, pop it out. There we go. There's the exhaust. And she's been milled and polished out. And when I did the exhaust and intake, I took the sides and the bottom down here, and I left the top alone because I don't want to take material away from the valve guide. You see the valve guide up there? And you can still see the material on the edge of the valve guide. Just like here, I left the valve guide alone, but I took the sides and bottom out so that you have a more straight through run there. You see that? It's pretty open and it rolls downhill, but I still have a lot of gasket area. And I used my inside caliper to check this edge here and make this down here match. And you can see I could shove my thumb all the way down. Oh shoot, I'm sorry. Alright, here we go. I can shove my thumb all the way down, and you can see it there. But I've got a fat thumb. I wear 13.5 size ring, so I've got big hands. But I could take my pinky, run it through, touch the other side. I could take my ring finger, run it through, touch the other side on the intake. And then we go over to the exhaust, and I could touch the other side on the exhaust. So I removed a lot of restriction, and you can see my valve seats. I mean, those are some beautiful high polished valve seats on the intake and the exhaust. You see my compression ring there. And that's not with using a polishing compound. That's with toothpaste on this one, and sandpaper grit and assembly lube on this one. And then Brad used the Fast Orange hand cleaner, the gritty stuff, and he polished his, and his looked just as good, if not better than mine. But that's no valve lapping tool or anything like that. It's all done by hand, and you can see we have at least 2 mil of valve seat on both valves. So you don't have to spend a whole lot of money to lap valves, just like you don't have to spend a whole lot of money to mill a head or mill a deck. You just, you got to hillbilly it together. Anyway, we'll see y'all later.